Thanks, Nicole. It's been fun watching the chats come in to see everyone's roles and the districts they work in or the states that they work in. Quite the range of folks participating today, and I think that's wonderful. So as Nicole said, my name is Carrie Thomas Beck. Those of you who are Oregonians may remember me as being the dyslexia specialist for the state of Oregon, worked at ODE for 4 years in that role. And then about a year ago, I was asked to take on a position at an organization called the Consortium on Reaching Excellence in Education. And I stepped into the role of Director of Literacy for the organization and have been working in that capacity since like last January. So it's absolutely a thrill for me to be back presenting to a group of educators, primarily from Oregon. I miss working with Oregon districts and Oregon schools. So thanks for coming today. And as Nicole said, I really encourage you to, if you have a question, type it in the chat. And I told Nicole to feel free to interrupt me at any time. I really don't mind. And I actually prefer that folks ask questions as they come up. So the title, well, first of all, the theme for today is inclusion. And I love that this dyslexia presentation was included on the day where the theme is inclusion, because those of you who have heard me talk about supporting students with dyslexia in the state of Oregon, you know that I always say that it's not a special ed issue, it's a general ed issue, and it's going to take a comprehensive system of support to really meet the needs of students with dyslexia in our state. So the title of the presentation is Supporting Students with Dyslexia in Core Instruction, and really focusing on how you can leverage instructional practice to provide instruction that really works for these students. So let's look at our objectives for today. So first, I want to do a really quick review of the definition of dyslexia, and then outline the learning profile of students with dyslexia, because that's going to help us think about then what would the instruction need to look like. I'm going to make the case for a prevention-based approach, and then describe the type of instruction students with dyslexia really benefit from in that tier 1 setting. We'll then go over, sorry, Nicole, some specific instructional practices to enhance tier 1 instruction. All right, so many of you may recognize this definition of dyslexia. It's the one that was adopted by the International Dyslexia Association back in 2002. And it's definitely the one that's most widely used when you look, for example, in different state legislation or administrative rules. Very quickly, I just wanted to walk you through these characteristics under the definition. And the first is that dyslexia is considered to be a specific learning disability. And those of you who are familiar with the federal definition of learning disability know that dyslexia is actually listed in that federal definition as a type of specific learning disability. Dyslexia is neurobiological in origin. It's organic in nature. It is something you are born with, and it's highly heritable. So if you have a parent or a sibling with dyslexia, the probability that you may have it as well can be as high as 50%, highly heritable. I think what most people know is that dyslexia is characterized by difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition, and it also becomes very obvious in a student's spelling. But what most people in the general community don't understand is that these difficulties with word reading and fluency result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. It's a language-based difficulty. It is not a visual-based difficulty. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this deficit in the phonological component of language in just a second. I did want to point out the other two components of this definition. The thing that makes students with dyslexia unique from other students with word reading difficulties is that by definition, this difficulty with word reading is very unexpected in relation to the child's other cognitive abilities and is there in spite of the provision of effective classroom instruction. So it's this very isolated difficulty and it's very unexpected. And then the other piece is that unfortunately, there are many secondary consequences as the result of not engaging in wide independent reading. And that is you see the lack of growth in vocabulary, building background knowledge, and then ultimately that's going to impact reading comprehension. So let's talk a little bit more about this deficit in the phonological aspect of language. So we can think of this as a phonological core deficit and this being the source for the word reading difficulties. David Kilpatrick outlined the different components underneath this phonological core deficit. And I just wanted to speak to these briefly. Probably one of the most obvious components of this is a child having poor phonemic awareness. I'm assuming most of you know that phonemic awareness is the ability to isolate and manipulate individual sounds in spoken language. So they're really having a hard time isolating those sounds, realizing that when we say the word man, there's actually 3 sounds in that word man. So that's a definite piece of this deficit. Second, and this actually comes underneath the umbrella of phonemic awareness, is students will have poor phonemic blending. And phonemic blending is basically just taking sounds and blending them together to make a word. So taking man and being able to blend it to the word man. And we know that in order to successfully decode, you have to be able to have those phonemic blending skills. Another piece of this phonological core deficit is poor rapid automatized naming. And basically, or RAN for short, and basically this is just the ability to quickly and efficiently retrieve verbal information from long-term memory, okay? Poor phonological working memory is also a very common characteristic of this deficit. Phonological working memory is often measured in a couple of different ways. One is non-word repetition. Another is repeating strings of numerals to see, again, basically how much verbal information a child can hold in memory for a period of time. And that working memory is holding it long enough in order to be able to do something with that information. Finally, students with this deficit traditionally will have poor non-word reading. So if you give them a nonsense word and ask them to decode it, they would likely experience great difficulty. And also they have difficulty mapping sounds to graphemes, so sounds to print, and they're not able to easily learn those letter sound correspondences. Oh, before we go to the next slide, one of the things I wanted to point out is, as per the dyslexia legislation in Oregon, the items that are starred are those items that Oregon districts are required to universally screen for in kindergarten. So I just wanted to highlight, and that's why we screen in those areas in Oregon. Okay, so I told you I wanted to make the case for a prevention-based approach to serving students with dyslexia. And recently I came across an article in the Reading League Journal. It was actually the last issue that came out in January and February of 2021. And it's an article by Hugh Katz, who's at Florida State, and Tiffany Hogan. And the title of their article is Dyslexia, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of diagnosis and treatment. And as you can imagine, that title caught my eye right away, and I dug right into that article. And I wanted to share some highlights from it with you. Next, thanks, Nicole. So one of the things that Katz and Hogan start out by doing is they are defining what they mean by prevention. And basically they're saying prevention does not mean prevention of the brain-based elements that underlie dyslexia. Remember, we talked about how it's neurobiological in origin. What prevention does mean, in the way they describe it in their article, is prevention of those severe reading problems that are the defining characteristic of dyslexia. So that's what they mean by prevention. Next slide. So we know, and there is research to show, that we can identify children who are at risk for dyslexia either before or at the very beginning of school. And we can provide early intervention that can significantly reduce word reading problems and also those secondary psychosocial consequences of these difficulties. You often will see a lot of anxiety associated with dyslexia. Excuse me. Let's go on to the next slide. One example I wanted to share of research supporting this idea of the power of early intervention is a recent meta-analysis conducted by Sharon Vaughn and colleagues. This came out in 2016. And what they found is that word reading interventions were significantly more effective for improving reading outcomes when they were administered in kindergarten and first grade than when they were administered during later grades. And that really says a lot. Okay. So Katz and Hogan identify, oops, yeah.
Carrie, we have a question that came up. Does the screening in kindergarten happen at the beginning of the year or the end?
So as per the Oregon administrative rules, screening in Oregon, oh boy, well, it's based on test publisher guidelines. So Oregon has a list of approved universal screeners. And I can't remember if the OERs actually say fall, winter, spring, but that's in reality what the test publisher guidelines call for. So it's not a single point in time, but rather we're screening multiple times across the school year.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah. So Katz and Hogan talk about critical factors to take into consideration when you're implementing MTSS for early identification and intervention. And I put their list of critical factors here, and I want you to notice the very first thing on their list, and I highlighted it for you, and that is high quality tier 1 instruction. And what they talk about in the article is how if we can provide evidence-based instruction in tier 1, that can really help determine the probability that some children have dyslexia and others do not. Because as we provide high quality instruction and intervention, children more quickly differentiate themselves from others and how easy it will be for them to learn how to read. Next slide. When Katz and Hogan describe high quality tier 1 instruction, they talk about it as being code focused instruction that involves phonological awareness, phonics, and fluency. They say that these code focused programs are more effective than approaches that rely on contextual factors for word reading. And they also stress the importance of including meaning-focused instruction to build vocabulary and background knowledge to improve students' comprehension. Next slide. So I also at this point wanted to share with you what to consider when evaluating programs for alignment with the science of reading in the words of Louisa Moats, and those of you who probably follow a lot of the dyslexia work are probably very familiar with Louisa Moats, who she's one of the main authors of the letters training, which is one of the trainings on Oregon's list of approved dyslexia training opportunities. But basically what Dr. Louisa Moats talks about when she describes high quality tier 1 instruction is that ideally there should be explicit instruction in foundational skills for approximately 45 minutes daily, and that you would expect to see this kind of routine. Start with review, explain the new concept, provide guided practice, provide more independent practice, spell and write to dictation, read decodable text. And that's all just part of that 45 minutes that focuses on the foundational skills, phonological awareness, phonics, and fluency. So Louisa goes on to say, then determine if the instruction in phoneme awareness, phonics, and text reading is informed by knowledge of both the speech sound system and the orthographic system, meaning the writing system in English. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what she means by that in upcoming slides. But the next thing Dr. Moats says is that you should examine the scope and sequence for order and pacing of concept introduction. She talks about how the intervention materials should be aligned with tier 1 classroom instructional materials, but provide more intensive practice. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, she talks about what to avoid. And she says, avoid any program that includes drawing shapes around words, making alphabetic word walls, teaching the cueing systems approach of appealing to context to guess at unknown words, or also avoid programs that do not follow a clear scope and sequence where one skill is built upon another. So lots of really good suggestions from Louisa Moats here. And some of these we'll dig deeper into. For example, we are going to talk about sound walls in just a minute. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And I don't think it's possible for me to present on dyslexia without at least having one slide to highlight the work of David Kilpatrick and the work that he published in his book. I don't know that I can say the title off the top of my head right now, The Essentials of Preventing, Assessing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, something very close to that. But it was published in 2015. And essentially what Dr. Kilpatrick did is he reviewed all of the reading intervention research out there. And rather than using effect size as the metric to determine effectiveness, he looked at growth and standard score points. And through that reanalysis of all of those research results, he came up with what he calls the formula for word reading success. And this is something to keep in mind as we're thinking about our tier 1 instruction, because these components need to be in that tier 1 instruction if we are truly going to serve students with dyslexia. So the first one is that we provide instruction on phonemic awareness. I want you to remember that word phonemic, and teach it to the advanced level. And what he means by advanced level is to make sure we don't just stop at teaching phonemic segmentation, but that we actually teach and provide many opportunities to practice tasks like phoneme substitution, phoneme deletion, phoneme reversal, because if a child can be very automatic with those more advanced phonemic awareness skills, that's going to give them the capacity to be very efficient and effective word readers and to be fluent readers. The second piece of his formula for word reading success is to make sure that we teach and reinforce phonics skills and phonic decoding. And then finally, we must provide ample opportunities to apply these newly developing skills to reading connected text. So we're going to go into greater depth on all three pieces of this formula. Let's take a look at the next slide. All right, so moving on to talk about instructional practices to enhance Tier 1 instruction to meet the needs of students with dyslexia. So as I was thinking about, it's been a year since I have had the opportunity to present to Oregon educators, and I was trying to think about what would be most useful for you. And I was reflecting on what is information that is new learning for me. What are articles or research studies that have come across my desk over the last year that can help us think about how to enhance our Tier 1 instruction with the dyslexia lens. So the first thing I wanted to share with you is I wanted to plant a seed about rethinking phonological awareness instruction. And recently I read an article by Susan Brady, and Susan Brady is an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Rhode Island. And her article was published in the Reading League Journal back in September and October, that September-October issue in 2020, last year. And the question that Dr. Brady posed is it necessary to teach a developmental sequence of phonological awareness instruction for students to gain phoneme awareness? And when we typically think about phonological awareness instruction, we think about sort of this continuum of difficulty. And I originally was trained where we want to start with those easier phonological awareness tasks as a means to get to those more difficult phonological awareness tasks, with the end goal being phoneme awareness, so the ability to hear individual sounds in spoken words. So we may have, and currently may still do, or provide instruction where in kindergarten, perhaps we're focusing a lot on rhyming words and alliteration as a means to get children started in that phonological awareness. And then we might move to sentence segmentation where students just clap words in spoken sentences. And then maybe we ask them to break words into syllables. And then finally have them pull off the onset of a word, k, at, and then say the rhyme. Before, like I said, we get to that individual phoneme level. I want to define a term. Susan Brady uses the term phonological sensitivity. And the way she defines that is awareness of those larger and more noticeable units of speech sounds in spoken words, like rhymes and onsets and syllables. So next slide. Based on a review of extant research, the points that Susan Brady makes is that the necessity of proceeding in K and 1 from phonological sensitivity instruction to phoneme awareness instruction is not supported in the research. So this was very intriguing to me. She says, instead, teachers in these grades, K and 1, should target student mastery of phoneme awareness, meaning if you're teaching K or 1, the research doesn't necessarily support the idea that you must start with words, syllables, onset rhymes as a mechanism to get to the phoneme level. And what Susan says in her article, and I love it, is she says, make no mistake, it is the phoneme level awareness skills that directly support learning to read and learning to spell. Next slide. So Dr. Brady provides a kind of a way to think about how to introduce phoneme awareness, to develop those phoneme awareness skills in K and 1 students. So if you're a kindergarten teacher, you would start with awareness of the external phonemes in words. So for example, you would start by focusing on the initial consonant in a spoken word. So like, what's the first sound in turtle? T, okay, like that level. And then you would move to identifying final consonants in spoken one syllable words. So what's the last sound in rope? And the students would say p. And then once you've built those awareness skills, you can work on awareness of the internal phonemes, starting with the medial phonemes in spoken consonant, vowel, consonant words. So taking a word like cat and having students isolate the a, that medial phoneme in cat. And then finally, moving on to helping students with segmenting those internal consonants that are in consonant clusters or like consonant blends in spoken one syllable words. So if you take the word black, students would get to the point where you can help them identify not only the b and the k and the a, but also that ul in that bull blend, that internal ul. So that's the way she describes what the progression would look like starting in kindergarten. Next slide. And then she talks just briefly about phoneme awareness instruction in first grade. And what she says is that that instruction should include the remaining consonant and vowel phonemes beyond those taught in kindergarten. So that would include things like diphthongs, consonant digraphs, etc. So you want to teach children to be able to isolate those phonemes as well, because those are a little bit difficult, are more difficult, and students will actually need the instruction to help them be successful with that, at least most students. The other thing, thanks, Nicole. So the other thing that Susan Brady discusses in her article is the importance of the integration of that phoneme awareness with letter sound instruction. And what she talks about is first, we need to make sure to establish the awareness of individual phonemes. So you need to provide some purely oral phoneme awareness. Well, by definition, phoneme awareness is oral, but you need to have some purely oral activities where students have the opportunity to listen for first sounds, last sounds, etc., and learn those phonemes. But then instruction in phoneme grapheme correspondences should follow. So that is taking those oral sounds and linking them to print. So a grapheme would be a letter or letters that represent a sound, okay? And she makes the point that linking phoneme awareness with letter sound knowledge strengthens the application of phoneme awareness for improved reading and spelling results. Thanks. So I'm going to kind of get into the nitty gritty here with you. And I want to talk about then this process of how you teach students to map those phonemes to graphemes. And I'm pulling again from the words of Dr. Louisa Moats, and you'll see there's a link here at the bottom of the slide. This was a conversation, a recorded interview with Louisa Moats that you can find online. And Louisa was talking about sound symbol cards. And these are cards that are a reference point to help students learn the connections between phonemes, the sounds, and graphemes, print. And what Louisa says, and I think this is a really important distinction, is that these sound symbol cards should be organized by, here's the sound, and here are the ways the sound can be spelled. So type in the chat, what comes first on your sound symbol card? What's the first thing that you focus on? Awesome, Stephanie, thank you. That was fast. So the first thing that your sound cards should focus on is the sound, and then the ways that you spell it, so the print. So what you can see here is the instruction is based on a sound to print progression versus a print to sound progression. And Louisa said, this is a very subtle but super important distinction. And so I want to ask another question, and you guys are perfect. Yes, see the fish, that sound, and then the spelling card. Yeah, sound, then spelling. Perfect. Image with the sound, then the spelling. You guys got it. So in the chat, I'm going to ask you a little bit trickier question. And the question is, why do you think it's important to focus on that progression of sound to print versus print to sound? Just like in one sentence, why is that important?
Perfect. And while our audience is working on that, Carrie, we did have a question pop up. So if we could address that after.
I think I saw it. Was it about teaching F and then PH?
No, it was about, it did relate to corresponding visuals.
Okay, so perfect. So thanks for that, Nicole. And there's another question in there too. So it promotes orthographic mapping. Okay, so the idea is, why are we focusing on speech to print? Our language is a speech to print language. They're already familiar with sound. Oh, these are coming so fast. The sound can be learned and then associated with the print. Oh, you guys, great answers. Yes, because so I think you guys are hitting this right on the head, or whatever that saying is. Never get my sayings right. But the point here is that we are wired to speak when we are born, and speech comes naturally to human beings. We are not wired to read when we are born. When reading is a relatively new invention, about 5,000 years old. And basically, when humans learned to read, they had to use existing parts of their brain and just connect them in different ways to learn to read, to map sounds to print. So because children naturally have this oral language, that's where we want to start. We want to start with what they know and then help them make that connection to print. So you guys, really nice job with that. So Nicole, why don't you ask your question? And then I think I remember the second question.
Okay, let me find it. It was a little bit longer. Okay, so this was referring to a question about the avoid list. So kind of thinking back to that. So when it says avoid using the cueing system approach of appealing to context to guess at unknown words, it sounds like that is saying avoid pairing words with visual pictures that they represent. What about when you are teaching students with autism who are visual learners? Many of these types of students also have augmentative communication programs such as Touch Chat and Proloquo to Go. Oh, that's a nice one. Which pair the same symbols with the buttons students need to communicate.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak kind of from the more general perspective. And what I'll say is that we want to focus on the strategies that strong readers use, on those strategies that the research support in terms of building strong reading skills, and using the cueing systems or pictures as strategies for reading words. Those are strategies that poor readers utilize, and they're not effective and they're not efficient. So I'm sorry, I apologize. I can't speak specifically to your students, but that would be my my general response to that question, is that we need to use those strategies that the research supports, those that strong readers use. If the task is reading, those are the strategies, or if the goal is reading, those are the strategies we should be using. You know, the exception would be if you have a student who is really low cognitively and is working more on functional literacy. And I think that's where it's a different, different strategy there. Okay, and then the real quick question I saw was, it was something to the effect of, do I agree with introducing the letter F as the first grapheme for the sound, and then the PH? And yes, and Dr. Brady talks about how you want to introduce the most common spellings first and then get to the less common spellings like PH. Okay, so let's go on, and thinking about these sound symbol cards, let's talk about sound walls. This is a great way to leverage your tier 1 instruction. So take a quick look at this real quick. And I just want you to notice, this one's kind of fancy because it's also organized by articulation, but notice how all these cards start with the sound, that keyword image representing the sound, and then it shows the different ways we represent that sound in print. So I chose this as the example because of that. Next slide. So I'm guessing sound walls may be very familiar for some of you and maybe less familiar for others. So to provide a little background information, the goal of sound walls is to elevate daily instruction during Tier 1 by reviewing the 44 speech sounds and then the options for spelling each of these sounds. The result of using sound walls is that it becomes automatic for students to access sounds and then know how to match spelling to each sound. And what I want to point out is that my content on sound walls all comes from Mary Dahlgren, who is, I think, the sound wall guru in our field. And if you want to go deeper into sound walls, look for Mary's work. I do have the source. This was it was more like it was a blog that she wrote on the Voyager Sopris West website. She wrote it last May. Let's go to the next slide. And in this blog, Dr. Dahlgren basically outlines the steps on how to use a sound wall effectively. So let me just walk you through briefly. And then again, I want you to dive into her blog, and I'll share some other resources too. But step one, she says, is you need to begin with speech sounds and then add print. And she's very specific about this in that she suggests that you introduce all 44 speech sounds based on the articulatory features. So what are your lips doing? Where is your tongue? Are your teeth involved, right? When you form each of these phonemes. And she says it'll be much easier for students to attach the different graphemes to those sounds if you do provide that information about articulatory features. It makes them more concrete, okay? Step two, she says, is to attach a keyword to help students remember the sound. And we just saw examples of that with our fish for the sound. And she also talks about teaching the most common letter or grapheme that represents that sound first, and then you add the other spellings as children increase their knowledge of the graphemes. Step three is to review and discuss all the sounds that have been introduced daily. And so as an example, she said, for example, you could say, all right, guys, find the A, and she means the long sound A. So find the A, and what are the common spellings we know for that sound? And then the children would say, oh, well, it's A, it's AY, right? It's A-E. So she really encourages to leverage that sound wall by having that daily kind of practice and review with it. Step four, engage in activities using the sound wall. Let me give you an example. There's many different things you can do for activities, but she said you could play the speech sound guessing game. And she says, basically, in this game, students imitate the sounds and look in a little handheld mirror to answer questions like, all right, guys, which sound is made with your lips? Is it P or K? And so students would look in the mirror and say, well, oh, we use our lips for P, okay? Step five, use the sound wall for independent learning by problem solving. Here's an example. She said, let's say that you are reading text in small group and the student has difficulty reading the word night, like it's nighttime. What you can do is point out the IGH and then direct the student to that long I sound card on the sound wall, and then ask them, okay, what do we know about IGH and the sound it represents? And they can look up and say, oh, it's the I, okay? So lots of ways we can use those sound walls. Let's go to the next slide. And I wanted to share two other resources. One is there's a nice little article about transitioning from word walls to sound walls on Reading Rockets. And the other is a really wonderful podcast. It's called Retire Your Word Wall, How Sound Walls Support the Science of Reading. And it's a podcast by Mary Dahlgren. Oh, I spelled her name wrong there. Shoot. I'll fix that. But there's the link for you. I listened to half of the podcast yesterday. It was excellent. I'm going to definitely go back and finish it. So we've been talking a lot about mapping phonemes to graphemes, what our sound cards might look like, and then how we can use those sound cards as a scaffold for students by posting them on the wall and referring to those daily. My question for you, and we haven't talked a lot about word walls, but my question is, why do you think it's important that we use sound walls versus word walls? I'll just pause, and if you have an idea, type it into the chat. Oh, I definitely have some skilled sounds walls people here. Hmm.
And Carrie, we also had another question come through if you want to address that after looking through the chat.
Sure. Because some words do not sound like the letter they are placed under. That, I think, is the linchpin. So think about like if the way that word walls are usually organized. They're organized alphabetically, right? A, B, C, D. And then you would put words that begin with each of those letters underneath. And think about the word the. What letter would that go under on a word wall? The letter T, right? However, when you think about the word the first sound in the is not t. So it can be really confusing. Yep. Good. Okay. Really great answers, you guys. So Nicole, do you want to pose the question? I think I saw it, but it got pushed to the top.
So one that came through was, I believe some sounds can actually be created in different ways. I discovered this when trying to teach my son how to say a sound, and his speech therapist did it a different way. I wonder how tricky this can get. I imagine there are more similarities than differences.
I would imagine there are more similarities than differences as well. And if there are little tweaks that help a particular child with being able to form that sound, by all means use that. But there are certain things that we can't avoid, like when you say p, your lips start out closed and then they open and a puff of air comes out, right? So that you do use your lips for p. But again, if there are minor tweaks, by all means give it a try. Okay, there was, oh, thank you, Nicole. I know somebody, or thank you, Nancy. Somebody was wanting the link to the slideshow again. So thanks for providing that. So I want to now move on from sound walls and talk about connected phonation. Again, remember the theme of today's presentation is what is my new learning over the past year? What has come across my desk? So there was a study that came out in the Scientific Studies of Reading in 2020. And the study was conducted by Linnea Airy and her doctoral student, Selenide Gonzalez-Fry. And the name of the article where they're describing the results is Connected Phonation is More Effective Than Segmented Phonation for Teaching Beginning Readers to Decode Unfamiliar Words. And a super catchy title, right? But this was really important information. Next slide. So I have two of the research questions in this study right here to talk about. Before I talk about them, some of you might be wondering what do they mean by connected phonation versus segmented phonation? So what they're talking about is blending. And when they say connected phonation, that means blending without pausing between the sounds. So if I'm sounding out and reading the word man, I would sound it out by connecting the phonemes, man, and then I could blend it, man. Segmented phonation would be saying each sound in the word with a slight pause after it. So, ah, and then asking the child to blend. So they actually, they looked at the extant research that compared the effectiveness of these two different approaches and designed their own study. And two of their research questions include: one, does connected phonation training enable children to learn to decode non-words more easily than segmented phonation training? The answer, based on their findings, is yes. Second research question: does connected phonation instruction with continuant consonants actually transfer and enable students to read new CVC nonwords containing stop consonants more accurately than segmented phonation? Guess what? The answer, based on their findings, was yes. Next slide. So here's what they found when they looked really carefully at student responses. So first, we'll start with the students in the segmented phonation group. So what they found is that these students spoke the sound of each letter separately. Well, we know that by definition of segmented phonation. They often added schwa vowels that had to be deleted. So that would mean, like, if you were segmenting the word ban, they might have said buh, ah, they had a harder time remembering the sounds they had just spoken when attempting to blend them to read the word. When memory slipped, they would often substitute another phoneme. And it was interesting because the memory of the initial consonant of the word suffered the most, and likely because it occurred earliest and it was just eroded in memory by the time they got to the point of blending the word. So that's what happened in the segmented phonation group. Let's talk about what happened in the connected phonation. So students in the connected phonation group actually didn't try to stretch the stop sounds, but rather they would link them to the sound next to them. And this proved to be very effective in them being able to correctly decode the word. They provided a whole succinct word rather than trying to stretch out or break between the phonemes. They avoided adding those schwa vowels. So when they blended the non-words, they blended them perfectly. And they more easily remembered the phonemes. And that included memory for initial consonants. So what does this mean for instruction? And so Dr. Gonzalez-Frye, well, I'll hold with this thought. This is one of her slides, and then I'll tell you where you can find her full presentation. But basically, she said that the findings suggest that decoding programs can be made more effective by implementing the connected phonation procedure. Specifically, this would involve teaching students first to decode CVC words with continuant consonants until they master that. And then you can progress to the decoding of words with stop consonants. And that should be a pretty easy transition based on their findings. Students in the connected phonation condition seem to have a better concept of how to bring separate phonemes in a word together. All right. Okay, so next slide. So what I wanted to share with you is that at CORE, every year we host a series of free webinars featuring national experts on various topics related to literacy and mathematics. And the one that we had just last month, or maybe it was this month, wait, is it still, we're still in March. Okay, maybe it was March. Selenide Gonzalez Fry, who was the then doctoral student who completed the study, led a presentation, and it's now a recorded webinar on CORE's website. And you can see the link. If you go to that link, it'll take you to all of the recorded webinars, and you can just scroll down to find the one on connected phonation, and then just click, and you can get access to her slide deck and the recorded webinar. But if you're really interested in the study and want to learn more, it was, I thought, a really interesting and informative presentation. Next slide. Oh, where'd Nicole go? Can you hit it, Beth?
I'm not sure. I can try. Well, no, because I'm not presenting it. Don't know what happened.
There she is.
Okay. I don't have it.
I knew you'd be back. Can you do next slide, Nicole? Thank you. Okay, so let's talk more about phonics and how we can leverage that instruction even more. So I don't know what year this book came out, but I know it's fairly new, probably within the last 2 years or so. It's a book by Wiley Blevins called A Fresh Look at Phonics. And I want to highlight some of the content here. And there's actually an article that Blevins wrote in Principal Magazine, and that's from the National Association of Elementary School Principals, and you have the link here to the article. It just came out in December of 2020. So if you want to read his full article, you can access it through that link. But next slide. What Blevins highlights in this short article in Principal Magazine is basically what to look for in phonics instruction. And I want you just to skim through these 7 items. And I want us to hone in on items 2 and 3, because those are things we haven't talked about yet today. So I want to talk to you just a minute about dictation for spelling, and then reading connected text. Next slide. Let's start with what Blevins says about dictation or guided spelling. So what he says is that dictation should begin in kindergarten. And one of the first ways you can do this is actually as you're doing phoneme awareness tasks, which often include like Elkonin boxes, or like a 3-square strip or a 2-square strip, where students actually pull a chip down to represent each phoneme in a word as they say the sound. That as a transition into spelling, you can have the children use letter tiles instead of those chips, or he calls them counters. Also, obviously, you're going to want to do dictation where the students are actually writing those sounds that you dictate, but that should begin in kindergarten. And he also talks about how teachers can analyze students' writing or spelling for evidence of them using the taught phonics skills. And that's a whole nother presentation, analyzing students' spelling. Let's look at the next slide. I don't know if any of you are members of, it's a listserv called Spell Talk. And it's a really wonderful listserv that addresses all topics related to literacy and has quite an outstanding membership. You'll be following different threads around different topics, and all of a sudden, you know, David Kilpatrick will chime in, or Tim Shanahan, or Jan Hasbrook, you name it, Louisa Moats, they all follow this. So if you are somebody who wants to kind of stay on top of the latest and have access to experts, I highly recommend that you sign up for this listserv called Spell Talk. But I wanted to highlight, there was a recent thread related to spelling, guided spelling, that I just wanted to share some key points with you. First is that when we're teaching spelling, we need to understand that spelling of words, whether the words are phonetic or irregular or partially irregular, that this is not a rote memorization task. That's how I learned spelling in grade school. That is not how we want to teach spelling. It is not a rote memorization task, but rather it's the integration of multiple language systems. And that includes phonology, the sounds, orthography, the print or writing, and morphology, which is the meaning of those words and parts of words. What we want to do is have students, rather than say the letter as they're writing words, we want them to say the sound, or I should say sounds of the word as they write the letter, so they can fully activate and integrate these systems. Okay. And then you might ask, well, what do you do with irregular words then? And there was a woman who shared in Spell Talk how she addresses it. It's just perfect. She teaches her students to say it wrong, to spell it right. So for example, if your first graders are working on spelling the word people, she has them say it to help them spell it. So the students say it, P-O, pull. So that way when they spell it, P is P-E, O is O, and pull, they know, is the P with the L-E. It's the syllable type, the L-E syllable type. So by using that strategy, say it wrong to spell it right, that is actually going to help them map that word to long-term memory. And after time, the MOI, which is the mental orthographic image, is firmly established, and they no longer have to say P-O pull when spelling people. And I will freely admit, when I was in grade school, I used to say Wednesday every time I had to spell Wednesday, but I can spell it automatically now as an adult. I'm happy to report. But we don't want to revert to flashcard use to get children to learn to read or to spell irregular words. There are almost always parts of irregular words that are regular. We want to grasp onto those because ultimately we need students to map those words to long-term memory. To get her, love it, to get her. I need a little tip for restaurant because to this day, I still cannot spell restaurant without pausing for a long time. Okay, so let's talk about reading connected text. So Blevins made a few points about reading connected text, and his main one is about the critical importance of the use of decodable text. And what he says in relation to decodable text is that this is an essential part of each day's phonics lesson. And I made it in bold, part of each day, right? And I say that because I recently was going deep into a very popular core curriculum, an English language arts curriculum, where their skills block only had one decodable per cycle, and a cycle was a whole week's worth of lessons. And one decodable text per lesson cycle was not enough. It would not help the students successfully be able to practice those newly learned skills so that they can become skilled readers. So the other couple things that Blevins says is that decodable texts actually have the largest impact on accelerating mastery of phonics skills. Realize that decodable text has a very specific purpose, and that is to allow children to practice those newly learned phonics skills. It's a temporary phase in time. They're not going to be reading decodable text their entire school careers. It's a phase, and it's a critical phase that we cannot skip. Blevins also talks about how writing about the decodable texts further extends the instructional impact of these cute little books that we're asking the students to read. What he says about leveled texts is that they simply often don't contain enough decodable words to bring all students to mastery. And I want you to think about that word all. And I want you to think about today's theme for the conference, which is inclusion, and how we really need to leverage Tier 1 instruction to meet the needs of all students. That's 90 minutes of their day. We need to leverage the instruction in that time. Next slide. So if you're in a district where your core program perhaps doesn't have the amount of decodable text that you need so that you can provide daily practice, that's linked to your phonics instruction, I've highlighted two resources for you here. The first is one that maybe you haven't seen. So this is on the Reading League's website, and you have the exact link right here. But basically, they have a list of decodable text sources, and you can see they just updated it in November. And it's a list. For example, you'll see Bob Books as one of them, and they're all live links. So you can just click on the link, and it'll take you right to the website, so you can learn more or order those decodables. And their list is like a whole page long, and they have it organized by like K2 decodables, decodables for older readers, and like decodables for all ages. So really, really nice resource if you're trying to find more decodable text. So I encourage you to check that out. And then I think, oh, next slide, Nicole. I think many of you probably have seen this resource for decodable text. So the University of Florida College of Education Literacy Institute has the most amazing virtual teaching resource hub. And I know that Oregon RTII has highlighted this hub in past trainings over the course of this crazy 2020 school year. But part of their virtual teaching resource hub is a link, and the link is right here on the slide. And it's basically a, oh, I don't have another slide. Okay, it's a link to, if you don't have access to digital books through your school or core program, it's a list of sources for free decodable digital text. Now, their list was a lot shorter than the Reading League's list, but they did have a short list where you could access free digital decodable text. So if you haven't been there, check it out. And while you're there, if you haven't seen their templates for developing online foundational skills in reading lessons, oh my goodness, spend some time there. Wonderful resources. Next
Carrie,
slide.
we had another question come up. Are you open to that?
Of course, yes.
Okay. So how do you handle it when students are going the other way? They use their decoding knowledge to read a word the way it quote unquote should be pronounced instead of how it actually is pronounced.
Oh, with irregular words?
Yeah, that's what I would assume.
Yeah. So I am somebody who have strong DI training in my background, and I think about how we teach irregular words in reading mastery. That's how you sound it. Here's how we say it. So we sound it, was. Here's how we say it, was. And what's crazy about that is that, again, over time, through that repetition, you will get to the point where students will look at WAS, and it'll be, that word will be mapped to long-term memory, and they'll just say was. It's crazy how that works, but it absolutely works. Okay, next slide. So we're actually doing perfectly with time. And what I wanted to do, just to sum it up, is to take all of these little tips that I just shared with you and put them into one table, or you could think of this as a checklist. And this would be for how to enhance your Tier 1 instruction in grades K and 1 with that dyslexia lens. But I will also say that this type of instruction is going to support any student at risk for reading difficulties, whether it's due to dyslexia or other reasons. This is the instruction that will reach all of the students. So we have our main themes here. So we want to target student mastery of phoneme awareness, and we can begin at that level in K. That, I think, is my most probably earth-shattering news. Second, introduce sound symbol cards organized from speech to print. Third, use a sound wall, don't use a word wall. Fourth, implement the connected phonation procedure. Fourth, or I guess this is fifth, sorry, include guided spelling to help students transfer their growing reading skills to their writing skills. And then finally, select decodable texts to accelerate the mastery of phonics skills. That is their purpose, to accelerate the mastery of phonics skills. Next slide. So I would like to take a minute and I want you to reflect and think about that checklist I just showed you. And here's food for thought. How will you use the information learned in today's session as you go back to your classroom or as you go back to your school or district office? What is one thing that you will do differently? And if you can just type that in a chat. Uh-oh, error when going to lead. Okay. When we're done, I'll show you how to hop on the Reading League site and find it. Oh, good, you guys. For those of you who are saying put up a sound walls, make sure you listen to the podcast from Mary Dahlgren. That was, I mean, it's excellent. Good, you guys. Connected phonation, yes. I don't know if any of you teach Wilson, but my understanding is that Wilson does segmented phonation. And so an easy fix would be just to make that enhancement and change it to connected phonation. Yes, please share with general educators. Thank you. Good sound walls with emerging bilingual students. Guided spelling, yes. And kids love guided spelling. Give them a whiteboard and a marker, although right now we can't, but even if they can play around with letter tiles on the screen. Good, you guys. Good. Okay, obviously you paid attention. Thank you so much. One last thing I wanted to share with you is, first of all, some free resources. So can you go to the next slide, Nicole? So if you haven't been on CORE's website yet, I highly recommend that you go check it out. And it's just corelearn.com. And I'm sending you there because there are a bunch of freebies. And we also have curated many of our resources into different libraries. So you're going to find that there's a word reading difficulties resource library. We've also curated all of our science of reading content into a library. So check out those libraries because they're full of great resources, all different kinds, whether it's an article, a recorded webinar, a link to online resources, you name it. The other thing that I really recommend you check out is our what do you call it? Not a library, but we just have all of our I guess our archive of recorded webinars, because we've been doing these annual webinar series for years and years. And so we have really top-notch national experts who have spoken on various topics. And again, you can access any of those recorded webinars for free. If you want to hear Susan Brady talk more about this idea of getting right to phoneme awareness instruction in kindergarten, she's one of our speakers in this upcoming school year's lineup. So watch for that. She'll be coming. Next slide, please. And also, if you're not aware, CORE does have an online elementary reading academy. If you have staff or if you personally just want to dig in deeper into the science of reading, it's a 7 to 10 week online course. And not only does it cover the 5 essential areas in beginning reading, but it also has an introduction to dyslexia. And it is on Oregon's list of approved dyslexia training opportunities for both understanding and recognizing dyslexia, as well as foundational skills in reading. Next slide. And oh my goodness, I know many of you probably have this book, but if you're looking for a good resource for teaching reading, highly recommend you check out the Teaching Reading Source Book. It is literally this thick. And I find that anytime I'm looking for an answer to a question, I just go to the index and it's in this book. It's amazing. It was written by the founder and former president of CORE. Her name is Linda Diamond. Next slide. Okay, and if you need to reach me, Here's my email address, and you can also follow CORE on Twitter or on Facebook. So again, thank you for being so attentive. An absolute pleasure to speak with Oregonians. I wish I had more opportunities like this. I miss you all. Feel free to reach out to me. And if you are the person who couldn't find the Reading League thing, if you hang on, I'll after we officially close, I'll show you how to get on there.